Hi, my name's Dan Tapper, and I'm currently exhibiting work at New Adventures in Sound Art called Helios 2024. The work is inspired by the sun and the fact that the sun is going into solar maximum this year. Solar maximum really is a high point of activity in the sun's solar cycle, and it happens about every 11 years. So we're going into 2024 as a year that's going to be a really exciting and vibrant year in terms of solar activity, sunspots, things that we can't necessarily see with our own eyes, but in this installation, I'm gathering using solar data from various probes, bringing that into the NAISA space in real time, and doing all sorts of experimentation to reveal that as a sort of a standard image, remanipulating that into new and imagined visual works, and also taking this data that's being collected by probes and converting that into sound. Some of these sounds are using quite traditional sonification methods where pieces of information are taken and directly converted into some kind of control value that changes the sound. So some of this is quite sort of classic, straightforward sonification techniques. And then other things I'm doing are a little bit more abstract and experimental, kind of pushing what a sonification can be. So we have a number of pieces set up in the space, and each piece is sort of exploring different aspects of the sun and how the radio that is naturally created by the sun, radio waves, are affecting us here on Earth. The piece that I'm sitting right now has a number of ways of accessing this data in real time and catalogues them visually and through sound. And it's a kind of a hybrid between something that is a generative evolving performance where the machine here is basically cycling through different states, different visual scenes, visual sonic scenes. But we also have an interactive element for the audience to participate in. So right now I'm on basically two sets of visualizations of the sun. This one here is a real-time log of the last 24 hours of the sun, taking those images and animating them, and that updates every day. And this image here is a sort of hybrid visualization taking up to the minute, about 5 or 10 minutes latency images of the sun, and then mapping out where sunspots and high and low activity are on the sun, and then using a digital system to revisualize that. So I have some control methods here where we can see as I move the knob here, I'm moving through different spectrum of light, and this is controlling how we see the sun manipulated through these different wavelengths with a real-time sort of generative response. And this can also be seen in the audio for the piece. So the audio here is built up of 3 components. The first component is taking this light spectrum of the sun and converting that bandwidth into frequencies that are played back on a multi-bank oscillator. The changes are quite subtle, but what we're hearing are these spectra morphing that oscilloscope bank very subtly. So that's the first component of the sound. The second component is based around the sunspots. So different frequencies we're picking up, different sunspots, I should say, different frequencies of light that are being visualized and converted here. And so we have quite a steady sort of ebb and flow to this staticky noise sound. And as we move through that, we're moving the consistency of that noise slightly. And then finally we have a bass tone, which is mapping again through this frequency, but rather than the previous two iterations, which were directly correlated to various sunspots, this one is basically reading across this line of pixels and converting that into a tone. So it's like a very short waveform made up of image data. And we can hear the tone stays the same, but the intensity changes as we move through these different spectrum. And altogether, we have a number of other visualizations that are happening in this piece, and so these are cycled through automatically, but also can be moved between scenes by the user. We have a lot of earlier data work I did with the sun back a couple of years ago, which is being recontextualized as part of this exhibit, and that's being mixed and melded into the work. We have this section you just saw, which is, again, superimposed with other layers, so you get a sort of a collaged effect through these different layers of imagery being juxtaposed together. You get these different evolving sort of composite images. And I also have some straightforward sonifications based on tabulated data. So in this example here, I have sun data that's been recorded from the mid-1800s to the present day. And I'm basically taking this tabulated data of sunspots that are recorded on the sun. So back in the 1800s, they would have been viewing this data and mapping it out by hand. Now, obviously, we use computer programs to do this. But I've been able to access this data, and I'm running through it in a very simple kind of graph-like structure. So we can see here on the screen we have the year, we have the number of sunspots total that were logged in that year, and then this is cycling through day by day, and so we can see that number kind of as a real-time ticker. On the second knob, I'm able to turn things up and down, and there's an auditory response on this fourth fader. This is a little bit of a counter to some of the more dense imagery and sound that we're hearing, like this, where throughout the course of the exhibition I'm gathering daily information that's recorded from the sun and creating this ongoing composite image. So in this section of the room, we have 3 different interlinking components of the installation. Over here we have a box which is connected to an antenna which is way up in the ceiling here. And what this box is doing is it's translating a radio frequency spectrum called the VLF frequency band. VLF stands for very low frequency, and it's predominantly a frequency where naturally produced radio signals propagate. So in the wild, this would be things like lightning, the northern lights. You can even pick up sunspots, really high electromagnetic events in this band. But as we can hear, when we're in a city or around electric grids, we just pick up the inherent hum of the electric grid around us. You can pick up some of that natural signal through filtering. You get little clicks and crackles, but largely we're tuning and playing with the hum that is all around us through the electric grid, through this little box here. And as the installation progresses, it brings out different tonalities using a fast Fourier transform filter, which brings out different parts of that frequency spectrum. On this section here, we are picking up VLF in a much less densely populated area. So this is VLF that's been recorded outside of the city with a live link that we're broadcasting and visualizing on this television right here. So we can hear here on this little VLF television receiver clicks and cracks as well as some hums. And so the clicks that we're hearing, those little crackles, this is lightning striking the Earth and then bouncing between the Earth and the ionosphere. And these lightning signals come from often thousands of miles away. We can really listen to basically half a hemisphere's worth of lightning propagating. The visual on the television here is a slowly updating frequency spectrum of that VLF band, and over time it distorts and there's some kind of creative visualization aspect as well, but at the core of it, it's taking a frequency spectrum and then just manipulating it visually, and the audio that we're hearing is completely unprocessed. It's just coming in live. So together we have the really man-made heavy 50 hertz hum, and over here we have the much nicer, more delicate, more sparse VLF coming in, naturally produced by elements of our ionosphere. In the event that there are extreme solar storms in the next couple of months while this installation's on, that should be reflected in the televisual replay, which is really exciting. And over here we have a little fun section of records. Real interest of mine in terms of working with data is the transformation of data. So we saw in the earlier video piece how some of those data streams I was kind of gathering, I was displaying in a really quantified way that was very obvious in the example of the graph piece for sunspots. And we could see how some were a lot less clear, perhaps. You have to spend a bit more time to actually understand what those relationships are between visual and sound and the core data. So for me, this idea of accessing data and translating it is really interesting, particularly questions around when does that data stop being kind of a quantitative thing? When does it stop being a value that we can sort of directly understand? And when does that transform into something that's more like an energy or an overall vibe that allows us to experience the kind of the artist's intention of being within, in this instance, the sun, without actually having necessarily a correlation, particularly to the underlying data. So this kind of interplay between very obvious kind of quantities that we can understand and more abstract sort of energies that we're translating, and finding the space between those 2 points can be quite challenging. So with the records, what I have done, and this is sort of an ongoing project in basically storing information in different materials. In this case, I'm storing information in acrylic. So what I have done is I have taken some very quantitative sonifications of solar data. Basically, each of these maps a different variable from the sun. So one layer is the sunspots from the last year, one groove is the chemical makeup of the sun, and then other grooves are taken from direct NASA sonifications. And what I've done in this kind of pursuit of experimentation and translation is I've managed to basically carve these into acrylic using a laser cutter to create very, very low fidelity grooves. And so what's interesting to me isn't necessarily so much the quality of the sound from these records, because the process itself takes so much of that fidelity away from the audio signal. It basically gives us a sound file that's about 8-bit or less. So it's a very low quality locked groove. But what I find really interesting is the ability to basically encode information into something, even if it is very rough and ready, very durable, and then be able to play it back and see what happens over time. So over the course of these installations, the records are going to get dust, they're going to get damaged by the needle, and the groove and the quality of the sound is going to change. So for me, it's a really kind of nice interplay between what I was mentioning with the qualitative data and the abstract data, where it takes something that starts off as a very straight mapping, and over time and through audience participation, it becomes something that moves from being a quite straight up mapping to something that's quite distorted, and how the repetition of data, the repetition of ideas becomes convoluted over time. We're changing something every time we access it or replay it. So that's the interest about these data disks. So for me, the motivation for creating this piece is firstly to celebrate the sun, which is a kind of a source of data I've been working with for about 4 years now, and taking that and celebrating it in its year of solar maximum, and taking basically probably the most interesting readings from the sun that are going to happen in this 11-year cycle. The first time I started working with sun data, it was a really low point in solar activity, and there were basically no sunspots that year. So this is a really interesting opportunity to explore a very volatile period for the sun. Recently, we had a huge coronal hole that was the width of about 66 Earths stacked together. So we're going to this place of quite a lot of volatility in the sun, and I'm hoping that will reflect in a really exciting way in the audio and the visuals that we hear. Something else that really excites me about this show and why I wanted to make it is I really love feeling immersed in sound and feeling immersed in images, and the opportunity to have an exhibition at NAISA meant I could bring a whole load of objects and installations together in a way that I haven't necessarily been able to do before. Often I will have a video that's on the internet, or a video that's screened, or an installation that's part of a show, but often I'm not able to put together a number of elements that work in harmony with each other. And the goal here is that people can come in and they can sit with these sounds, which overall are quite meditative. There's lots of drones and hums and clicks and crackles. And the hope is people can sit with these sounds and kind of create their own diffused mix by moving around different elements of the piece, going up to the records and interacting with them. And through being in this installation and being able to ambiently experience data and move through different data streams, people are going to get a whole new way of thinking about the sun, which is something that is so fundamental to our life here on Earth that we often overlook.